An 84-year-old woman left her house to a homeless man, and when he entered the house, his jaw dropped. This is a touching story. Watch until the end to know the outcome. It was an autumn afternoon, and dry leaves covered the park ground. Mrs. Lucy, an 84-year-old lady, was walking slowly with her wooden cane. Her eyes, despite her age, sparkled with youthful curiosity. That day, she noticed a man sitting on a bench, with worn-out clothes and a tired expression. He was John, a homeless man who had been living on the streets for more than a decade. Mrs. Lucy, moved by an impulse of kindness, approached him with a smile. "Good afternoon, young man. Would you like some tea?" she asked, offering a thermos. John looked at her surprised but accepted the offer, nodding his thanks. As they drank tea, they started to talk. Mrs. Lucy spoke with a softness that comforted John, and he slowly began to open up about his life. He told her how he had lost everything in a series of unfortunate events, from unemployment to health issues that left him without resources. She listened attentively, without judgment, only with genuine empathy. "You shouldn't be alone in these conditions," she said after a while. "I have a big house and I've been alone since my husband passed away. Why don't you come live with me? You can help me with some things, and in return, you'll have a warm place to stay." John blinked, incredulous. "Are you serious, ma'am?" "Of course I am," she replied with a smile. "Everyone deserves a second chance." That night, John accompanied Mrs. Lucy to her house. Upon entering, he was amazed by the place. The house was large and well kept, with antique furniture and photographs that told stories of a well-lived life. He felt welcomed in a way he hadn't in years. And so, John began a new life at Mrs. Lucy's house, not knowing that this was just the beginning of a journey full of surprises and emotional discoveries. In the days that followed, John quickly adapted to his new routine. He helped Mrs. Lucy with daily chores, like taking care of the garden and doing minor repairs around the house. In return, she treated him like a family member, offering not only shelter and food, but also companionship and friendship. One morning, while they were having coffee in the kitchen, Mrs. Lucy began to share more about her life. "My husband Alfred and I bought this house right after we got married. We spent many happy years here. He was a wonderful man, always ready to help others." John listened attentively, intrigued by the stories. "What did he do for a living?" Alfred was an architect. He designed many of the houses in this town. He was a talented and generous man. Unfortunately, he passed away 5 years ago. Since then, I've been living alone. "It must have been hard," John commented, feeling a lump in his throat. "Yes, it was," admitted Mrs. Lucy. "But I found ways to move on. Helping others gives me strength. And now, with you here, I feel like I'm doing something good again." John smiled, feeling grateful for having found someone so kind. But the feeling that there was something more in that house didn't leave him. He noticed that Mrs. Lucy always avoided talking about one of the rooms on the upper floor. The door was always locked, and he never saw her go in there. One day, while cleaning the hallway, John couldn't resist his curiosity and asked, "Mrs. Lucy, what's in that room? I've never seen you go in there." She paused for a moment, and a shadow of sadness crossed her face. "That was Alfred's office. After he died, I just couldn't go in there anymore. It's like a part of him is still in that place." John understood that this was a deep wound and decided not to press further. But deep down, he felt that the room hid something important, something that would eventually come to light. One night, while the wind was blowing hard outside, John was in the living room reading a book when he heard a noise coming from upstairs. It was as if something had fallen in the hallway. He climbed the stairs slowly, trying not to make any noise, and saw that the door to the mysterious room was ajar. Curious and a little apprehensive, he pushed the door open and entered. The room was full of books, drawings, and models. It looked like Alfred had left everything just as it was on the day he died. In the center of the room, there was a table with a large model of a house. John approached and noticed that the model was of the very house he was in. As he examined the model more closely, he noticed something strange. There was a small hidden compartment in one of the corners. Carefully, he opened the compartment and found a small wooden box. Inside the box, there was a key and a letter. With trembling hands, John opened the letter and began to read. It was a letter from Alfred to Mrs. Lucy, written shortly before his death. In the letter, Alfred revealed that he had hidden something very valuable in the house, something he hoped she would one day find. The key, according to the letter, opened a safe hidden in the basement. John quickly went downstairs, his heart racing. He found Mrs. Lucy in the kitchen and showed her the letter and the key. She was in shock, tears filling her eyes. "I didn't know about this," she said, her voice trembling. "Alfred never told me about that safe." Together, they decided to go down to the basement and look for the safe. After a few minutes of searching, they found a door hidden behind some old boxes. The key fit perfectly in the lock, and with a click, the door opened. Inside the safe, they found a collection of valuable items, old jewelry, important documents, and a diary of Alfred. Mrs. Lucy was moved to see those items, memories of a life full of love and achievements. But what caught John's attention the most was a small metal box hidden at the bottom of the safe. Upon opening the box, they found a series of letters, all addressed to Alfred, but from an unknown sender. The letters revealed a secret correspondence that Alfred maintained with a childhood friend, discussing an ambitious project they had planned together. John read aloud, "Alfred, our dream of building a shelter for the homeless is closer to becoming a reality. I secured the necessary funds, and now we just need to find the perfect location." Mrs. Lucy looked at John, surprised. "I never knew about this. Alfred never mentioned this project to me." "Maybe he didn't want to worry you," John suggested. "But it seems he was determined to help others just like you." In the following days, John and Mrs. Lucy read all the letters and discovered more about Alfred and his friend's plan. They wanted to transform the house they lived in into a shelter for homeless people, a place where they could find refuge and start over. Unfortunately, Alfred died before he could realize this dream. Inspired by the discovery, John proposed to Mrs. Lucy that they continue with Alfred's project. "We have the house, the resources, and the will to help," he said. "We can turn this place into something wonderful, just as Alfred wanted." Mrs. Lucy agreed, feeling a renewed sense of purpose. Together, they began making plans to remodel the house and adapt it to receive other people in need. The news spread quickly through the community, and soon, volunteers started showing up to help with the work. As the transformation of the house progressed, John and Mrs. Lucy began to share their stories with the volunteers and neighborhood residents. More and more people felt inspired to contribute, bringing building materials, furniture, and even offering free services. Mrs. Lucy's house became a symbol of hope and solidarity. One morning, while organizing some old papers in Alfred's office, John found a document that intrigued him. It was a deed to a property located outside the city, in a rural area. He showed the document to Mrs. Lucy, who was surprised. "I had no idea Alfred owned this property." They decided to investigate more about the place, and the following weekend, they went there. The property was vast and included an old abandoned farm. As they explored the place, they found a large house, but in terrible condition. However, what caught their attention the most was a barn that seemed to be in better shape. Inside the barn, they found more models and drawings by Alfred. He had planned to expand the shelter project to include a rehabilitation center, where residents could learn new skills and work on the farm to sustain themselves. It was an ambitious plan, but now it seemed within their reach. "We can do this, John," said Mrs. Lucy, with determination in her eyes. "Let's continue Alfred's legacy and turn this place into a center of hope for everyone who needs it." John agreed, feeling more and more connected to Alfred's dream. In the following months, with the help of volunteers and community donations, they began restoring the farm. The work was hard but rewarding, and little by little, the place began to come to life. During this period, John and Mrs. Lucy developed a deep friendship. He came to see her as the mother he never had, and she saw him as the son she always wished for. Together, they faced challenges, but also celebrated each small victory, each step towards the greater goal. One day, while planting trees on the farm, John asked Mrs. Lucy about Alfred's past. "He seemed like an amazing man. How did you two meet?" Mrs. Lucy smiled, reminiscing about the old days. "I met Alfred when I was just 19 years old. He was a young architect full of dreams and ideas. We fell in love quickly, and decided to build a life together. He always had a generous heart and a vision for a better world. When he proposed to me, he said our love would be the foundation for achieving great things together. "And you really did," said John emotionally. "And now we're continuing his work." As the project advanced, John noticed a change within himself. He stopped being just a homeless man and became a pillar of the community. Helping others gave him a renewed purpose, and he felt more alive than ever. Mrs. Lucy, for her part, also found a new reason to live, dedicating herself to the project with an energy that surprised everyone around her. One afternoon, while they were working in the farm's garden, they received an unexpected visit. A middle-aged man, dressed in an elegant suit, appeared at the gate. He introduced himself as Mark, an old friend of Alfred. "I heard about what you are doing here and wanted to come personally to thank you," he said. Mrs. Lucy and John were curious about Mark's connection to Alfred. They all sat on the porch of the house to talk. "Alfred and I were friends since childhood," Mark began. "He always talked about his dreams of helping others. It moves me to see that you are making that dream a reality." Mark shared stories about Alfred that Mrs. Lucy had never heard before. She discovered that Alfred had helped many people anonymously, funding education and opening doors for those who needed a chance. "He was a true hero," said Mark with tears in his eyes, "and you are honoring his memory in the best possible way." John was impressed by the stories of Alfred's generosity. He felt even more inspired to continue the work. "We're just getting started," he said. "There's still much to do, but with the community's help, we'll succeed." In the following months, the farm became a hub of activity. Besides the shelter, they started offering professional training courses and occupational therapies. People who arrived there not only found a place to stay, but an opportunity to restart their lives. Mrs. Lucy dedicated herself to teaching cooking and gardening, while John coordinated the construction work and took care of the property maintenance. Their partnership became an example for everyone, showing that with solidarity and effort, great things can be achieved. As the project continued to grow, John began to notice that something was changing within himself. The feeling of emptiness and despair that had accompanied him since he became homeless was disappearing. He felt more connected to life, to the people around him, and most importantly, to himself. One day, while working in the garden, he met a young man named Peter, who had just arrived at the shelter. Peter was only 20 years old, but had already been through many hardships. He was shy and withdrawn, reminding John a lot of how he himself had been at the beginning. John approached him and with a smile said, "Welcome, Peter. Do you need help with anything?" Peter looked at him, surprised by the kindness. I don't know where to start," he said, his voice trembling. "Don't worry," John replied, putting a hand on the young man's shoulder. "We all start like this. Let me show you how we do things here." With patience and care, John taught Peter how to take care of the garden, plant seeds, and tend to the plants. Gradually, Peter began to open up and share his story. He had run away from home due to family conflicts and had nowhere to go. Finding the shelter was a true blessing for him. Seeing Peter's progress brought immense satisfaction to John. He remembered how Mrs. Lucy had welcomed him, and now felt he was returning the same kindness he had received. Peter began to gain confidence, and over time, became one of the most active members of the community. Life on the farm was busy and full of surprises. One day, while organizing the library, John found an old envelope hidden among the books. It was another letter from Alfred, this time addressed to him. Curious, he opened the letter and began to read. "Dear John, if you are reading this letter, it means you found the place where I kept my greatest dreams. I know that for some reason, you ended up on the streets and faced unimaginable hardships. But I believe that, like me, you have a resilient spirit and a will to make a difference in the world. Let me tell you a secret. I knew that someday you would find this place. It may seem strange, but I always believed in destiny. And destiny told me that one day, someone with a big heart and a strong mind would continue my work. Thank you for being that person. Take care of Mrs. Lucy and this place with all your heart. With gratitude and hope, Alfred." John was moved as he read Alfred's words. He felt even more committed to the mission of transforming the farm into a place of hope and renewal. He shared the letter with Mrs. Lucy, who was equally touched. "Alfred was always a visionary," she said with tears in her eyes. "And he was right about you, John. You have brought new life to this place and to me as well." Time passed, and the farm became a thriving rehabilitation center. People of all ages and backgrounds came seeking help and found a welcoming home. Alfred's project, continued by John and Mrs. Lucy, had become a magnificent reality. One day, while John was in the garden, a well-dressed man approached. "John?" he asked with a friendly smile. "I'm Alfred's lawyer. I have some important news to share." John was surprised, not understanding the reason for the visit. "Of course, how can I help?" The lawyer explained that Alfred had left a will, but it was only to be opened when the project was fully realized. "Alfred left a substantial fund to ensure that the work here never stops," said the lawyer. "He trusted you and Mrs. Lucy to manage this fund and continue helping those in need." John could hardly believe what he was hearing. "This is incredible," he said, looking at Mrs. Lucy, who was beside him. "We can do even more." With the new resources, they expanded the farm, creating new wings and services. They opened a school, a medical center, and several professional training workshops. The place became a beacon of hope for the entire community. Years later, the farm was still thriving, a true legacy of love and solidarity. Mrs. Lucy, now over 90 years old, remained active and present, inspiring everyone with her energy and dedication. John, for his part, had become a respected and beloved leader. At a special ceremony, with the entire community gathered, John gave an emotional speech. "This farm is more than a shelter. It is a home for all who need a second chance. And this was only possible thanks to Alfred's vision and Mrs. Lucy's kindness. Thank you all for being part of this dream." Applause and tears of joy echoed through the place. John looked up at the sky, feeling deep gratitude for everything he had lived and achieved. Life, which had once seemed so cruel, was now a journey of love, overcoming, and hope. And so, the story of Mrs. Lucy, John, and Alfred became a legend of inspiration, showing that with heart and determination, it is possible to transform lives and create a better future for everyone.